a mysterious abandoned ship, an elusive tropical island, a horrific disease that turns its infected into...
That's right! Today we're talking about Zombie 2, otherwise known as Zombie Flesh Eaters or just plain old zombie. Now this little gem was directed by one Lucio Fulci. If you're a horror junkie and you want to pretend that you're into cinema, then definitely check out his work. Alright, let's just get right into it. Ian McCulloch plays Peter West, a journalist in New York City who's a bit of a womanizer and can't decide if he's British or American.
What can I do for you, Chief? I'd have settled for an empty boxcar.
He's tasked with investigating this suspicious vessel that's drifted into the New York harbor, and coincidentally checks it out around the same time as someone else. Tisha Farrow as Anne Bowles is the daughter of the man who owns the boat. Distrusting the police report, she finds out her father was conducting some medical research on this fictional Caribbean island named Matul. Yeah, medical research. Well, it's a horror movie and there are a bunch of white people, so they naturally go cruising headfirst into danger. Ushering them into their unknown demise are Brian and Susan, two amateur sailors played by Al Cliver and Auretta Gay, respectively. Anyways, Susan gives us some gratuitous 70s nudity because this film, set in the Americas, wants to remind you that it's still Italian. Right before the greatest scene in cinema history. Get ready for the
Zombie versus Shark Underwater Showdown.
This isn't a spoiler. If anything, it's an appetizer for the cannibal buffet that is the film's climax. And the fact that, this is only the second zombie the audience sees and it's already doing something ridiculous and over the top, that should clue you into what kind of movie this is. Anyways, the rest of the movie is a montage of the recent undead chowing down on the living like they got the munchies. But you know the drill. Watch it yourself. It's free on YouTube, yada yada yada. You guys want to see a magic trick? Subscribe. You see that little red circle that just appeared around the subscribe button? You see, you've been conditioned by the site to gravitate towards red arrows and circles, so why don't you go ahead and act on your natural instincts? Alright, so what's with the titles? Why is it sometimes called Zombie, sometimes Zombie 2, occasionally Zombie Flesh Eaters? Well, to put it shortly, George Romero released a sequel to his 1968 classic Night of the Living Dead called Dawn of the Dead. The film was co-produced by Italian filmmaker Dario Argento, who slightly edited the film and had it released in Europe in some form or another as Zombie, Dawn of the Dead, etc. Then Lucio Fulci, a different director working on an unrelated zombie movie, is forced by his producers to retitle it Zombie 2, to cash in on Romero and Argento's work. In America, this was released as just Zombie, and this is the movie we're talking about today, not to be confused with the European releases of Dawn of the Dead, which are also called Zombie. Then the producers crack the whip at Fulci's poor hairy Italian back and say, "Make Zombie 3 or you'll never see your family again." So he does. It's a critical bomb that he barely had any real hand in making and doesn't even follow the continuity of the original. Zombie 3 is released in America, title intact, spawning this confusing trend of retitling a bunch of random horror movies to add them to the zombie franchise for brand recognition. That's why there's no Zombie 2 in America. There's 3 movies called Zombie 3, 2 called Zombie 4, 5, and 6, 1 Zombie 7. Zombie Flesh Eaters is its own thing in Britain. I explained this in my confusing movie titles video, but none of you watched that, so I'm doing it here again. The point is, we're just gonna call it Zombie. Thank you. That being said, this sequel-based infamy kind of overshadows Zombie and leads a lot of people to believe that it's a cheap knockoff of Dawn of the Dead, just because it's packaged with all these other Z-grade zombie movies. Guilty by association, so to speak. It's kind of like how you were a good student, but all of your older siblings were misbehaved, so your teachers already hated you the second they saw your last name. Can't relate? Me neither, I was an only child. But dare I say it, I actually enjoy Zombie a lot more than Dawn of the Dead. Crazy, I know. To the 3 people that give a shit. It's undeniable that Romero's Dead series is far more iconic, but I find a certain allure in Fulci's interpretation of the zombie mythos, and I'd even argue that its social commentary is the more scathing and critical of the two. The technical execution of this movie is incredible, boasting the proud honor of having the nastiest looking reanimated corpses on film at the time. This may look tame by today's standards, but the most violent modern zombie movie people have seen up until this point was actually Dawn of the Dead, with their blue skin and strawberry syrup blood. But these zombies are utterly disgusting, with the literal live maggots being incorporated into the effects work. I bet this made 70s audiences vomit all over their bell bottoms. And, in true Italian fashion, occasionally tomato sauce was used in the special effects. That's right, the blood dripping from the zombie's mouth here is tomato sauce. So, fun fact about me real quick. For a couple of Saturdays, I actually took a special effects makeup course during high school. And on the first day, the instructor was actually wearing a zombie shirt. And we bonded over the film and we talked about how much we both liked it. And that's when he told me something about it that I never really considered. He said something along the lines of, the special effects are only as good as the cinematographer shooting them. So, let's dig deeper into that, shall we? Camera movements are utilized very well here, especially that of the subtle up-tilt reveal. Special shout out to cinematographer Sergio Salvati. There's a clever little shot in the first scene right after the patrolmen finally shoot the zombie on the boat. As it plunges into the depth of the New York harbor, the camera tilts up slowly to a wide shot of the city. This is film visual communication at its finest, implying that everything is fine and nothing bad is gonna come out of a bleeding infected corpse being introduced into the environment. But yeah, it's a fun little setup that you may not even realize until the cataclysmic ending. A similar move is made on a smaller scale a few scenes later, from the chalk outline of the body up to Anne's mortified face as she confirms to the police that this is indeed her father's boat. And I very much think people sleep on Tisha Farrow's performance in this film. When she needs to look terrified or scared, girl looks like she's tweaking. More incredible camera work comes when we're introduced to Dr. Maynard and his wife Paula, played by Richard Johnson and Olga Carlatos. Dr. Maynard, like Anne's father, is also studying the strange disease on the island, and Paula is a woman who is also there. It's a European movie from the 70s. There was no way it was passing the Bechdel test. Anyways, the shot begins on the doctor's hands fiddling with a radio transmitter, up to his reflection, to a profile shot of his face, and then back to the mirror to show Paula entering behind him. How's that for a Spielberg oneer? I'll have Sergio Salvati himself describe the philosophy behind his camera work.
Pure consigliare a Lucio di stare più lontano, non stare come siamo noi vicino così adesso a 3 metri, 4 metri, ma stare più lontani con lo zoom stretto, perché dietro sfogava pure gli altri che venivano avanti, ricordi le passeggiate. Allora stai sul primo a fuoco, però gli altri li vedi e non li vedi sfogati, perché lì il fuorifuoco dava ancora una verità di bruttura, di gente che... Ma fotografare i zombie e mettere la luce sui zombie che sono finti, e poi cercavo di mettere la luce nei punti più brutali per fare le ombre dal basso, molta la luce dal basso, proprio perché dovevamo rendere che quelli erano zombie veri che nascono dal nulla, dall'aldilà o quello che sia. E io ho avuto un momento, ti dico la verità, come direttore di fotografia, di avere un attimo di pensiero, ma questa luce come la posso fare per abbrutire, per non a lasciarli sottotono, e poi ho lasciato molte ombre e molta luce, non la luce come a questo momento ce l'ho io in faccia.
But by far my favorite scenes are of the zombies themselves, especially in the intense close-up tracking shots that punctuate their arrival on screen. The woman with the bloodied face in particular always freaked me out. I think what makes it so impactful is the medium close-up of the gang barricading themselves in just before she pops onto screen. You go from seeing Ian McCulloch's British face from a distance to BAM! Just like a jump scare. It is the same principle that made that spooky maze game so effective back in the day. Speaking of being up and close to the face, let's talk about the eyeball scene.
Don't worry, I'm not gonna show the actual clip, God!
But yeah, for those of you who don't know, this film has one of the most infamous eyeball mutilation scenes in film history. Even with the clear aging of the visual effects and the fact that gore of this kind doesn't usually bother me too hard, this one still kinda gets to me. You can always look it up yourself, but for those of you who want to keep your 70s bell-bottoms vomit-free, a woman locks herself in her house to keep the zombies out. She tries to barricade the entrance with a dresser when a hand suddenly breaks through, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her eyeball first onto a jagged piece of wood from the splintered door. Yikes. This actually leads me to something I always feel like pointing out when it comes to violence towards women in horror, and the ways that Italian genre films like to make statements about gender, sexuality, and violence. I want to quickly read from a section of this book, Beyond Terror, The Films of Lucio Fulci by Stephen Thrower, that goes into incredible depth about this scene. There are numerous ways of replaying Mrs. Maynard's fate. A traditional viewpoint would claim that the scene indulges in a pathological hostility to women, thrilling to the penetration/obliteration of a woman's eye. And yet one could counter that the predominantly male audience itself is being surreptitiously penetrated by the image of female suffering, required by macho viewing standards to keep watching despite the repression they commonly exert upon their masochism. The victim may be a woman, but simple gender coding is surely challenged by an image which implies passivity and receptivity. You did watch it, didn't you? And as a male, why watch when all the eye violence is being presented? The result is that an audience, which may largely be male, is forced by the complicit act of viewing to identify with a suffering female. Such cross-gender identification is often used as a tactical critique of phallocentric viewing practices, and placed under the mark of the male in crisis. But it could simply be that all viewers, male and female, experience common humanity by observing the nightmarish penetration of the eye. I find it unlikely that a male viewer could shrug off his anxieties about the soft parts of his body merely by attributing the exorbitantly filmed eye mutilation to a plight suffered by femininity, even if Miss Maynard's eye is heavily made up. This is what I appreciate most about Zombie and Lucio Fulci's films in general. They sort of wear the mask of exploitation while also commenting on the society that enjoys that kind of entertainment to begin with. I can get into this more when I talk about other Italian films later on this channel, but I feel like the average American's overall ignorance towards the existence of Italian cinema to begin with is due to this particular style of communication that they tend to use. This Italian sense of relativism and ambiguity, where things are purposefully obscure and mysterious, is something that is often misunderstood here in the States, and often mistook for what it most superficially resembles. Whether it's the spine-chilling ambiguity of the beyond or the dungeon synth trippiness of conquest, Lucio Fulci's films are known for being dreamlike and absurd. Zombie may seem more grounded at first, but you'll soon find that its supposed concrete explanations for itself are all a facade. Diverging narratives form to explain what's happening on the island, evident by the many characters studying and rationalizing the disease while the locals hold to their beliefs. However, there's still a hint of a deeper, unknown terror, the slightest what-if that lingers behind even the surest of empirical proof. Fulci was always very good at handling this sort of metaphysical horror, a sly suggestion that maybe these smug Westerners shouldn't write off the islanders' superstitions so hastily.
Apart from a handful of superstitious natives, I'm the only one.
Here is where Fulci's zombie film differs the most from Dawn of the Dead, and why I really think trying to associate the two with the zombie title changes was unnecessary. George A. Romero, despite being given credit for creating the genre with Night of the Living Dead, never actually called his creatures zombies. If anything, he used the word ghouls, but stuck mostly to referring to them in the abstract.
When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk here.
Romero's Dead series established the mythos in terms of how zombies move, what they look like, their level of sentience, etc. He was quick to portray his new monster as a criticism of American capitalism, setting the climax in an abandoned mall where the reminiscence of consumerism are almost comedically juxtaposed with literal mindless consumption. The zombies here are likened to mall shoppers, with the haunting image of them trying to do in death what they all couldn't get nearly enough of in life.
George Romero's commentary focused on the consumer level. Fulci, on the other hand, pointed the bony, rotten finger at the top of the food chain, where the real horrors are committed. Make no mistake, the man was not quiet about his political beliefs. Describing himself as a Marxist and getting minorly involved with politics in his early life, even so, many of his fellow leftists in Italy at the time actually harshly criticized his work. You see, kids, the left has been eating each other alive way before Twitter.
There's a concept in Lacanian psychoanalysis called the lamella, or the space between two deaths. Everyone's favorite communist raccoon turned human by a witch, Slavoj Žižek,
I'm gay, I am a man who wants to do it with men.
dissects this concept in his 1997 book, Plague of Fantasies. This paradox of moving statues. I'm not gonna do the voice. I'm sorry. This paradox of moving statues, of dead objects coming alive, and/or of petrified living objects, is possible only within the space of the death drive, which, according to Lacan, is the space between the two deaths, symbolic and real. For a human being to be dead while alive is to be colonized by the dead symbolic order. To be alive while dead is to give body to the remainder of life substance which has escaped the symbolic colonization. Lamella. I find this concept interesting because not only does it apply to the zombie archetype, but I like Žižek's use of the word colonized.
Hey, how about this?
What is it?
It's a helmet. Must be all of 400 years old.
The third act of Zombie begins with the characters discovering an old Spanish conquistador helmet, not long before the dead start rising from their graves in the film's most iconic scene. I cannot assume that the detail was incidental, as someone with even the most basic understanding of this continent's history knows the evils that were committed to settle these lands. How cruel Christopher Columbus and other sadistic maniacs from the Iberian Peninsula were to the Taino people, the horrific conditions of the French slave colony of Saint-Domingue, an American manifest destiny driving us to displace, disenfranchise, and erase the indigenous people of the USA. And we are only now beginning to acknowledge the horrors of residential schools, where indigenous children were taken from families and forced to assimilate into American culture. Colonization is zombification, removing your identity, your freedom, your right to life, and reducing you to a husk of the person you were. And I think this movie, whether intentional or not, is an allegory for the D word, and a pessimistic one at that. Decolonization. There is no explanation, satisfying conclusion, or message of hope when this film is done. Just a continuation of the cycle of violence and the bleak realization that all this ever was people eating each other alive. The ending shot is one of the most chilling conclusions in all of horror history. An army of stumbling corpses marching on New York City. This is one of the most visually morbid allegories of colonization coming back to bite Western civilization in the rear. The vengeful spirit at the heart of this movie has nothing but disdain for those who live under the fruits of land seizure and exploitation without even comprehending the rivers of blood that run through their cities.
Now, I feel like I need to clarify, watching interviews with the production designer, the cinematographer, the producer, anyone involved in the making of Zombie, no one actually explicitly stated that it was an allegory for anything, let alone something political. However, I will die on the hill that Zombie is about radical anti-decolonization because zombies themselves are a response to colonization. But first, we need to acknowledge the harm that's being done here, and address the fact that this entire film genre is committing a deep sacrilege with every entry in it.
Hollywood is doing such a good job by making us look like the evil person. That's not what it's all about at all. It is not us.
Vaudou is a religion where I light my candle and I pray to my spirit. Just like anybody goes to church or they light their own candles and pray to their saints and God.
The word zombie itself has an assortment of disputed etymological roots, all of which exist within the context and cross-sections of colonialism. You bet your thesaurus this language nerd right here would love to elaborate on every possible answer, but for the convenience of this video, the word can be from a range of different sub-Saharan African languages, with meanings ranging from soul, spirit, to boogeyman, or even God. How the concept later became associated with malevolent undead creatures is a lot more concrete and can be traced back to modern-day Haiti. In Haitian Vaudou, the Bakong religion, and all related practices, a zombie is a very specific spiritual concept. Essentially, there are two parts of a whole that make up a person, their sense of self and their physical body. A Vaudou priest, often referred to as a bokor, has the ability to remove a person's spiritual self, leaving behind an enslaved husk forced to perform tasks for their master. I highly recommend this episode of Monstrum on PBS's Story channel that dives deeper than I'll ever have time for, going into how even the nuances have nuances, and how there are many different reasons the zombie became what it is today.
It's assumed, when you say all I've only known it as negative, we're looking at Haiti. And the usage of Bokor in Haiti, which can be negative. They promote themselves in a very negative way. I want it clear that I'm not trying to represent Haitian voodoo, that I'm indeed Louisiana, Mississippi Delta, West African voodoo. So that's another reason why I adopt and earn the right to use Bokor. And so many words, including voodoo, were bastardized once we got to this side of these names, these titles, these lineages. We still fight over them today.
One could argue that a zombie from the very beginning was always an allegory for slavery. It was the way that the African diaspora in the New World dealt with the trauma that came from slavery, not too dissimilar to the concept of being between two deaths introduced by Lacan and Žižek. And it is no coincidence that Lucio Fulci set zombie in the Caribbean rather than the States like Romero. So with that framework in mind, what can the zombie apocalypse genre teach us? What does it mean to portray society's collapse at the hand of a creature whose origins are a direct result of how that society was built? While the conflation is still a harmful stereotype to practitioners of Haitian Vaudou and other religions, in some way we are having our cake and eating it too here. We are using Hollywood's gross misappropriation of their beliefs to deconstruct years of European exploitation of the global South through a thinly veiled sardonic revenge fantasy on film. It's sick, twisted, gory, and it's based. In Zombies' universe, the horrors of colonialism must be paid back in full, with blood. This is full-on sins of the father, biblical punishment type shit. Very Catholic of Fulci. And as you sit there watching the undead rip men, women, non-binaries, and children apart, in some ways you must realize that they're only passing on the cycle of violence that was brought to those islands century ago. One may ask, what could compel a human to kill and eat the flesh of another? Surely the answer must be based in the supernatural or science fiction. But similarly, what could compel a human being to subjugate and brutalize entire populations of their own kind? The answer, as history so bitterly relates to us time and time again, is that we cannot help being absolutely horrible to one another, to put it lightly. Cruelty is right up there with fear and happiness as one of our most basic, primal feelings.
Perhaps that's why zombie movies appeal to us so deeply. It's more comfortable to indulge in the fantasy that only through dark ritual or supernatural means or incurable disease might we be inclined to commit an act so heinous. For each and every one of us, it is infinitely harder to stare the horrors of this planet's history in the face, all of the bloodshed and mass death, and say, I am man, and I have done this to myself. Hi guys, thanks for watching. Hit me with a subscribe, a like, a comment. I love it when you guys comment about the movies you've seen recently, how you felt about the one I'm talking about. Let's nerd out together. We're gonna pray to dear Lord Buddha that this video actually gets out relatively close to Halloween, but we'll see if I lock in. You see, the fact of the matter is, I own way too many of these. I've seriously been tracking down and collecting every single movie that has ever been called zombie, at least the ones I can confirm. The fact that all of these films exist and are just retroactively called a zombie movie is absolutely insane and fascinating to me. So why don't I just make a video about that?